Okay, so I'm Lucy, Project Manager of Portland Museums, diving into the digital archives of the Earl of Abergavenny project. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, basically. With me is David Carter, who's a Portland Museum trustee and one of the original divers and excavators of the Earl of Abergavenny. We're being hosted by Alison James from MSDS Marine, who's a maritime archaeologist, Nautical Archaeology Society trustee, and one of our partners on the Earl of Abergavenny project. So today's webinar is going to be split into 3 sections before finishing with a Q&A. We'll begin with the background story to the final journey of the Earl of Abergavenny. David will take over for the story of the salvage and excavation, and I'll finish with the current project to digitise the collection of finds retrieved from the shipwreck. Finally, we'll have our Q&A session for you to ask David and I any questions you might have, and you'll also have the opportunity to give us some feedback afterwards. So let's start. The Earl of Abergavenny was a British East Indiaman on a trading mission from Portsmouth to Bengal and China. On the evening of February the 5th, 1805, a combination of human error, the peculiarities of the local coastline and stormy weather forced her onto the notorious Shambles sandbank, which is located about 2.5 miles southeast of Portland Bill. After a number of hours stranded on the bank, she came free of it, headed for shelter in Weymouth Bay, but sank within sight of land, sadly with a loss of around 250 lives. So the Earl of Abergavenny was one of the largest East Indiamen ever built, weighing in at 1,200 tons. She was laden with cargo estimated to be worth about 90,000 English pounds, which is the equivalent to over 8 million today. The cargo on board the ship comprised a wide variety of goods to be supplied to the British administrators and army officers in Bengal. Cotton, rice, sandalwood and indigo would be transported from Bengal to China, with tea, silk and porcelain picked up in Canton for the voyage home. In addition, the Earl of Abergavenny was carrying a large quantity of silver dollars, worth at the time around £70,000, and this would be to pay for the goods it would be picking up in Bengal and China. Also collected in Bengal and bound for China would be a consignment of opium, which would form a substantial part of the overall profit Captain John Wordsworth stood to gain from the voyage. And on a wider scale, Britain's support of the opium trade at this time was helping to finance payment of the East India Company administration, as well as the ongoing war against the French. So, the captain of the Earl of Abergavenny was John Wordsworth, brother of the Romantic poet William Wordsworth. Sadly, there aren't any paintings or pictures of John, but what you can see here on the left is a portrait of an East India Company captain that was painted around 1800, so of a very similar time to that which John would have been working. To its right, you can see a drawing of William Wordsworth. Although John Wordsworth was one of 5 children, he was particularly close to William and sister Dorothy and dedicated to supporting them financially. So what was he like as a character? If we go back to his early life, unlike his siblings, he wasn't academic, and his family described him as a dunce. His father nicknamed him Ibex, the shyest of all beasts. William called him the silent poet, and later on, his crew called him the philosopher. He's described as often being seen pacing the deck in a reflective manner and reading poetry written by his brother, Spenser, and Shakespeare. He was known for disliking social occasions and society gossip and would stay on board ship when it docked. Described as enigmatic, he would probably be thought of today as an introvert, but although he wasn't gregarious in manner, he was still capable of working the East India Company system to the advantage of his maritime career. So what were the financial gains to be made by an East India Company captain? The private trading opportunities afforded to officers of the East India Company, coupled with the profitable trading route of Bengal to China, meant that John Wordsworth was set to make a personal fortune from the Earl of Abergavenny's voyage. Captains could make as much as £30,000 from a trip to China, with the route stopping off in Bengal being the most profitable. Much of the money John Wordsworth was forecast to make, he planned to use to improve the lives of his brother and sister, William and Dorothy, at their home in the Lake District. So how did this work? Instead of a fixed salary, East Indiaman appointments came with allotted cargo space for captains and officers to fill with items to trade. Before the voyage, a captain's time would be spent raising credit from family and other investors to purchase and trade the most popular and profitable commodities of the day. Further profit could be made from passenger fees, sums of which were decided upon by the captain. Despite maintaining steady employment on company ships and rising quickly through the ranks, to this point, John Wordsworth's voyages hadn't proved financially lucrative, which applied some pressure on this trip to pay off his debts and secure the financial well-being of his family. So how would he would have achieved the role of captain? Achieving the rank of captain was not, on the face of it, difficult to achieve. The prospective candidate would have to be over 25 years old and gained experience as a second or chief mate on a minimum single voyage. In the past, however, this arrangement had led to an excess of candidates for roles that could only be filled once an existing captain had left his post. So the appointment of captain would be achieved, therefore, not just by hard work, but by determined personal campaigning amongst allies. Amongst John Wordsworth's influential circle was the abolitionist, William Wilberforce, and his cousin, Captain John Wordsworth Sr. So who else was on board the Earl of Abergavenny, and what were conditions like? Well, accounts vary here, but there were approximately 160 crew, 160 troops belonging to the British Army and East India Company, and 80 passengers, 32 of whom were recorded as Chinese. Nationalities of crew members were recorded as Irish, American, Danish, Russian, Prussian, Italian, Portuguese, Swiss, German, and Chinese. So there was a great diversity of nationalities. Although there were only 3 women recorded as passengers, there is evidence that, as was the case with many ships, also women and children, there were also women and children on board who were unrecorded. These were probably family members of the crew, and we know this from some of the eyewitness accounts to the sinking that were printed in some of the narratives published at the time. The living conditions for soldiers, crew, and their families would have been extremely cramped, with all these groups being herded together into the same space. So everyday life on board the Earl of Abergavenny would very much depend on your status, sex, and reasons for travelling. Nowhere is this more apparent than looking at the different types of food available to the travellers and the design of the ship itself. The entire trip from Portsmouth to Bengal and China was estimated to take 10 months. So quantities of food and drink to meet the needs of the crew and passengers would have to be carefully calculated, obtained, and loaded in Gravesend before the ship's departure. Kept on the poop deck of the ship would be livestock to be butchered on board in order to maintain adequate quality stocks of meat for the high-ranking passengers and crew. In the hold, towards the bow, would be barrels of salted beef and pork for their lower-ranking counterparts. The sheer number of sheep, cows, pigs, and poultry accommodated on East Indiaman led to descriptions of the ships as floating farmyards and walking larders. And you can well imagine the variety of smells and sounds that would have drifted into the cabins located in the roundhouse. So the rooftop of the roundhouse was the poop deck, and the cabins were often separated by just canvas dividers. Dining on board could be a pleasant affair for the high-ranking passengers and crew. For those invited by the captain to his table, the main meal of the day would take place at 2 p.m. The menu of an East Indiaman, similar to the Earl of Abergavenny and in service at the same time, was recorded to include pea soup, roast leg of mutton, hog's puddings, 2 fowl, 2 hams, 2 ducks, corned round of beef, mutton pies, mutton chops, stewed cabbages and potatoes. followed by an enormous plum pudding and washed down with porter, spruce beer, port, wine, sherry, gin, and rum. Sounds like a particularly heavy Christmas, doesn't it? Games would be played after dinner, and there was also music as entertainment. The female passengers would enjoy less freedom than the men, as they would be confined to their cabins for a larger proportion of the time, and restrictions placed on the quantity of wine they were permitted to drink. In contrast to the food provided for the wealthier passengers and officers, English sailor Samuel Kelly, in 1781, described the barrels of pork supplied to the ship's crew as being of infamous quality, going on to write that they consisted of pigs' heads with the iron rings in the nose, pigs' feet, and pigs' tails with much hair thereon. Although there were in the region of 400 crew and passengers on board the ship, it's worth remembering that the Earl of Abergavenny was first and foremost a trading ship. The purpose of its design was to meet the needs of the East India Company investors, maximising space for goods to be transported in the cargo holds and traded across South and Southeast Asia. Although trade was its primary function, East Indiamen would also be well armed should engagement with pirates or national enemies arise. So there was a whole community of people living aboard this ship, and the wide variety of jobs carried out by the crew included butcher, baker, cook, carpenter, sailmaker, surgeon, armourer, and cauterer, to name but a few. You can see on this slide some of the objects that were excavated by David and his team during the excavation of the ship. They give you a really good idea of the variety of crew and passengers and their reasons for travelling. So you can see a wonderful games piece here, a domino, one of the pieces of 8, one of the silver specie that was on board, a great cattle bone showing signs of butchery in the top left-hand corner, a clay pipe. So we've heard about life on board the Earl of Abergavenny, but what happened when the ship hit the Shambles? We'll talk through what happened now and then follow up with why the ship sank afterwards. After the Earl of Abergavenny struck the Shambles at 5 p.m, the troops on board assisted the ship's carpenter and his team at the pumps in the desperate race to rid the ship of the enormous quantities of water she was taking on. Repeated violent strikes of the ship's hull against the sandbank, caused by the tides and stormy weather, meant that the troops and crew were engaged in the unceasing and futile task for a period of around 6 hours. Urged on by their comrades, they worked tirelessly to keep at bay the continuously rising water level, despite many of them suffering from severe seasickness. So the captain had planned to sail for the relative safety of Weymouth Sands when the ship came free of the Shambles. When it became apparent that the Earl of Abergavenny was taking on too much water, the ship's cutter, carrying East India Company dispatches, was launched in the hope that the men aboard would find help from the shore or from the other ships in the convoy. However, none was forthcoming. Another small party managed to leave the ship when a nearby vessel sighted the ship's distress signals. A senior East India Company merchant, his daughter and niece were rescued by a small skiff the vessel had sent to aid them. As the ship reached the point of no return, some of the passengers and crew threw themselves into the sea, grasping at animal coops and pieces of wreckage to keep themselves afloat. Some climbed up into the shrouds, clinging to the masts that remained above the water level. When rescue boats eventually arrived, amongst the chaotic conditions, the remaining survivors were able to board and were taken to the safety of the shore. In the aftermath of the sinking, a few survivors shared the accounts of their experiences with various publications of the day, and an official East India Company inquiry followed. The bodies of the drowned, including that of the captain, were buried together at White Regis Church in Weymouth. So why did the Earl of Abergavenny sink? Like a lot of shipping disasters, there wasn't one reason for the ship sinking, but a number of factors conspiring against her on that day. There were three primary reasons for the sinking of the Earl of Abergavenny, apparent during the time of the investigation by the East India Company after the event. Severe weather conditions, the hazardous coastline features peculiar to Porton Bill, and human error. During the next section, David will talk in more depth about the findings of the post-excavation investigations into the sinking. So firstly, the weather, and I'll pause during this section every now and again for you to make sense of the map and the story. So having left Portsmouth and heading west, the Earl of Abergavenny and the convoy it was sailing in had successfully navigated Porton Bill, but were battling strong westerly gales in Lyme Bay, which, as you look at this map, is to the west of Porton Bill. So the commander of the convoy she was in decided to turn the ships around, and with the help of local pilots taken on to assist the ships navigate the coastline, they headed for the safety of Portland Roads. So sailing east this time and heading back the way she came, the Earl of Abergavenny navigated a route southeast of Porton Bill. But as the wind dropped, the strong outgoing tide drove the ship head on to the Shambles sandbank. So let's have a look at the coastline. The area in which the ship sank is notoriously hazardous to shipping. In the top left-hand corner of this chart, you can see two dark patches. Those indicate what's known as the race. The race, in its simplest form, is a meeting of the tides and causes continuously rough and choppy water, even on a calm day. The Shambles sandbank, which looks like a tadpole in the bottom left-hand section of this chart, is a shoal of sand and shingle at its most shallow point being only a few meters deep. So together, these two features have been responsible for the loss of many vessels and lives over the centuries. It was while the ship was stranded on the Shambles, her hull repeatedly striking against it for a number of hours, that a larger part of the damage was done, and she took on too much water to safely sail to Weymouth Bay. In the days before GPS, navigation would have been aided by seeking marks or visual references, landmarks on shore. When key marks could reliably be seen, a ship would be considered to be in a safe enough position, i.e. far enough away from a hazard like the Shambles, in order to avoid it and sail a safe course towards its destination. At the time the Earl of Abergavenny was lost, those marks would have been Portland Bill, the lighthouse, and White Regis Church in Weymouth, which you can see in the very top right-hand corner of that chart. Now at 5 p.m. on a stormy February evening with the light fading, what were the chances of the Earl of Abergavenny's pilot obtaining a clear enough view of the White Regis Church mark to be sure that that ship was wide enough and clear of the Shambles? So last of all, let's look at human error. Across many modern and historical accounts, the pilot that the Earl of Abergavenny picked up to help it safely navigate Porton Bill is blamed for the crucial error that led to it striking the Shambles and subsequent loss. By all accounts, when rounding the Shambles, the captain is said to have asked the pilot, "Are you sure you have your marks open?" To which the pilot supposedly replied, "Yes." Frustratingly, although there is a reference to an affidavit made by the pilot to the official East India Company inquiry, and despite the company's prolific record keeping, this crucial piece of evidence has never been found and is presumed lost. Regardless of the responsibility for striking the Shambles, the ship, while stranded on the sandbank, was still thought by Captain John Wordsworth of being able to sail as far as the shallower waters of Weymouth Bay, when the tide changed and it floated free. Decisions were made by the captain and later much criticised by the press for his resolve to continue the ship's course to Weymouth Bay instead of launching the ship's smaller boats to evacuate the passengers and crew. There's a considerable amount of historical and contemporary evidence to say that that would have been a time-consuming strategy that would have distracted the crew from continuing their course towards safer waters. This ultimately absolved the captain of any blame. Now, there was a strong sense of conflict between the responsibilities of both the pilot and the captain. Ultimately, the captain has responsibility for the ship, but practically speaking, the ship's course would have been determined by pilots such as Thomas James, who would have been familiar with and supposedly more knowledgeable on the dangers of the local coastline. So the quote you can see at the bottom of the screen there were the words reported to have been spoken by Captain John Wordsworth on realising that his ship, having struck the Shambles, would never reach its destination. And of course, he was to lose his huge investment that he'd placed in the cargo of the ship. In the end, and much to the relief of William Wordsworth, the East India Company inquiry that followed the ship sinking cleared Captain John Wordsworth of any wrongdoing. This was despite many rumours circulating at the time that he was depressed and not in full command of the ship. So the pilot has always taken a larger part of the blame for the sinking, although he was denied a voice with the mysterious disappearance of his affidavit. David's going to take over now and continue the story of the ship salvage operations and excavation.
Hi. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Lucy, for your very excellent description of the sinking of the Abergavenny. I'm going to start my presentation on Tuesday, the 6th of February, the morning after the sinking, when the people of Weymouth would have woken up and looked out across the bay and would have seen the mast and with the sails and all the people in the rigging waiting to be rescued. And during the day, 150 people were taken off the ship by small boats in Weymouth. However, as Lucy described, there was around 400 people on board the boat, and whilst we have shipwrecks and we get rather romantic view of gold doubloons and treasure and things like this, the horrible fact of the matter is there were 250 people who died, and they came from all walks of life. As Lucy mentioned, there was officers, crew, soldiers, passengers, and also she mentioned the Chinese crew, which are often referred to as lascars, who were sailors who were able to crew the East India Company vessels back to England, but in order to preserve English crew jobs, they would actually go back as passengers. And yes, there were wives and no doubt children, and apart from the animals for food, there was, certain to our knowledge, 2 dogs, because we have seen the bones of the dog who were carried on board, probably lived all their lives on board as ratters. So what happened to all these bodies? It's a horrendous thing to try and imagine. 250 bodies, or although many were still probably left in the wreck, arriving on Weymouth Beach bit by bit over the days. They were buried in unmarked graves, and there is no more than about 8 graves, tombs, or monuments to those that died. And they're in St Anne's Church in Radipole, which is just an area of Weymouth, and in Preston, there's another young midshipman. And there is a few monuments to from where the John Grace, where his family was in St Andrews and in Monymusk. as I move on to the next slide, and this is All Saints Church in White Regis, which probably had a majority of the people were buried there. But it was actually John Wordsworth, a captain, who was not recovered his body for 6 weeks. He'd been floating around in the sea. Must be an absolutely horrendous occasion when his body was finally brought ashore. And he is buried in the Buxton grave, Buxton vault in All Saints Church, which actually itself is unmarked. Buxton was the MP for Weymouth and a very prominent abolitionist, responsible for a lot of reduction in the number of capital offences and the abolition of slavery. So it is at this time that the East India Company, as Lucy said, was making they had various accounts in their investigations. And what rather appealed to me was that the fact that the authentic narrative by a gentleman of the East India Company was priced 1 shilling. And then there was a corrected statement, which was only 6p. And I've put an image on the right-hand side of the purser's plan. It's a lovely sketch of how the purser saw what had happened. And it's just such a tragedy that Thomas James, the pilot, that his affidavit is missing. So we now move on to the salvage, which the salvage started almost immediately, and local Weymouth people from Portland were going out to the wreck and collecting material off it. The deck of the wreck is only 25 feet below the surface and well within the capacity of most people who snorkelers today would certainly be able to get to the deck. And some of the items that were brought up in that early stage there's a bowl, which is on the right hand side, which was given to the customs officer of the day, and has come down his family, and now is in Portland Museum. And there's a silver cream jug which was recovered, which is actually is owned by Barbara Cumming, Ed's wife, and is on display in Dorset Museum. But the main item there is Captain John Wordsworth's sword, which was the Wordsworth family were very keen that that should be found, and it was indeed found and returned to the Wordsworth family. Now, here are a couple of adverts for auctions, and it's interesting to note the date. Monday, the 22nd of April, there was a sale by public auction of pieces of the mast, rigging, spars, boats. It just all the bits and pieces that were so easy to get off. And this is just it's the first Monday after Easter, and it's barely 10 weeks from when the ship sank. And these auctions continued by being recovered bit by bit. You'll find that the next auction in August, it's smaller items that, sails and cordage and cables and sundry materials. Now, the East India Company were more interested in the bullion on board and the cargo. There was a lot of the £70,000 worth of silver bullion was the main target, and so they asked for people to make proposals in order to recover the bullion. And this picture here, which is by Mr. Tonkin, it's a very, very famous picture that is reproduced endlessly, and it shows Mr. Tonkin's diving machine, where it is up on the top left-hand side. Well, unfortunately, there was no record that Tonkin ever did have a diving machine actually working, and he wasn't the successful salvor. But the image he shows there is very accurate. It was very famous. In the bottom right-hand corner, there's a there was a cartoon in one of the newspapers which showing a political cartoon, and with a diver down below shouting "haul up," which is very similar to the image. So it just shows how famous this particular image was. But the successful salver was in fact a Mr. Braithwaite, and it was Braithwaite and his son, both Johns, and they actually dived they did the salvage from a bell. And the image on the sort of top left-hand corner is of something like the bell they would have used. There is no record of exactly how he achieved this, but he worked on the wreck for a best part of 3 years and recovered as much as he could. The middle image is actually of his notebook, which we have a copy of this notebook. And he, amazingly, in 1805, blew off the side of the ship, and a piece 90 foot by 30 foot, he blew off and towed it away so he could enter the side of the ship and recover the bullion. On the right hand side, there's a picture of Mrs. Braithwaite Jr., who obviously the Braithwaites benefited from this, and he invested his money into the building with Ericsson, a Swedish engineer, a railway engine which challenged Stephenson's rocket at the Rainhill trials, but was unsuccessful. And I'm sure that was the money they made from the Abergavenny, which was invested in this in the train. Now, all the time he is actually doing his excavation, there is a series of auction notices here, and you'll note that by now in Hope Street there is a place called the Abergavenny Storehouse, where because they had clearly had so much material, and we're getting down to quite small stuff, cloth and bottles of sherry, Madeira, and sets of Wedgwood tableware. Now, the other very interesting thing about Braithwaite is that in 1806, he actually took tourist trips down in his bell, and Mrs. Bennett of Cadbury in Somerset actually went down with him and spent 40 minutes underwater in his bell investigating the Abergavenny. Quite an exceptional concept of a lady going down on such a venture. So when Braithwaite eventually, after 3 years, said there was very little else he could find there, he departed. And the next people who appeared was in 1847, some 40 odd years later, which was the Dean brothers. Now, the Dean brothers were the first salvors who were really divers, and they had diving equipment. And he actually took several items from it, and which he had a watercolor painting done of the artifacts he found, which is at Whitstable Museum. And the interesting thing is the artifacts themselves look very similar to the state in which we found them 150 years later. The bottom left on that picture, there's a spoon and the gun flints in concretion. Now we're going to move forward a chunk into the 1960s. Now, the Abergavenny was blown up as a hazard to shipping, and so there was it wasn't until the 1960s, with scuba diving was available, that material started to come up. Now, his picture on the left is a local fisherman who brought up a cannon. Fortunately, it was never conserved, and nobody knows what happened to it. The young boy there actually was actually the skipper of the boat that we used as a dive platform. Now, on the right hand side, there's a pin, a single copper pin, and I put that in because there was all along the keel of the wreckage, there were large copper pins which unfortunately in the 60s were cut off and sold for scrap. Center picture is which is a piece which we hope to will come to Portland Museum, is a brass lid, and it was collected by Ted Nicklin, a famous diver of the 60s. And the reason I mentioned that is when I was looking for the Abergavenny, which I had become interested in, I was told by Ted Nicklin the marks or where to find it, and it has such a lovely romantic story that if you go out into Weymouth Bay and you can see the white horse cut into the hillside. Excuse me, I'm going to have a sip of water at this stage. As you go across the hill in front of the white horse, slowly conceals the horse, and when you can't see the horse's head, but you can see the rider's head, that is where the Abergavenny was. And sure enough, we did that with the Oxford branch, and Julie found the wreck site. Now, at this point, I'd been fascinated by the wreck and the story, and I got the Oxford BSAC branch of divers to try and to encourage them to sort of continue investigating the Abergavenny, but they weren't that particularly interested in that specific wreck. And so this is when I met Ed Cumming in 1980, and we met on the beach, and we compared notes of experience of trying to find the Abergavenny. And Ed had a group from Chelmsford, which was described as Chelmsford Underwater Archaeological Unit, and so I joined that Ed's group. And there were other people from other parts of the country, particularly in London, as Peter Kingston, Mabel Crook, and such like. Now, Ed had a vision that he wanted to do this project properly, and as an amateur group, was determined that it would be carried out in the best possible practice of the day. So it was to survey the site, excavate it, conserve any finds, document the finds, and display them to the public, and then publish the findings. And all this information gained will be freely available to everybody. And that was one of the very key elements. There was no sort of personal gain. And in fact, the whole operation, which was run for which we never ever contemplated in 1980, that it would still be running in 2020, 40 years later. The little group on the right-hand side is the first, one of the first expeditions out, and you will find me there as a young boy. Anyway, part of the project was actually to do non-disturbance surveys, and these were done for a variety of techniques: the proton magnetometers, multi-beam sonar, side scan, and a basic seabed survey. Actually, the survey done by the proton magnetometer was done by Ed's son Rafe when he was at university. We also had a survey by a marine biologist, Lynn Bullock. So what was there of the wreck? Well, the visibility is appalling. It's a lot of silt. There's virtually nothing above the surface, and the section through the wreck indicates where the seabed was. All the material above the seabed was blown up as a hazard to shipping, or removed or eroded away over the 200 years. And what is left is the area below the seabed, buried. And my drawing on the right-hand side is what impact we were discovering. So how did we do it? Well, to start off, we used a technique called an airlift, which proved to be too expensive, too very awkward. We had to hire hydrovane air compressor and cranes and things like this. So this is a system, and it was not particularly suitable for our particular use, and we used something slightly different, which was a water dredge. And Ed had perfected the water dredge, and the way it was done, the way it was constructed, was provided to anybody who was interested in actually doing it themselves. We were given, he gave them all the details that were necessary for them to build a dredge. But basically, you have a water pump on the back of the boat, and then it's pumped, high pressure water is pumped down, and it provides a vacuum, so you can, at the left hand side of the large tube there, that's where it's sucked out, and the debris is blown away far away off the site. And we always had a diver down there in order to check that nothing was lost at the suction end. And this is Ed's boat, Aquajeep 2, which, and you can see how it was in that sort of neat arrangement it was. So what did we achieve? Well, between 1979 and 1983, using a 3-meter grid, we excavated holes, documented what we found, and then recovered everything back up again to preserve it and in the silt. And we were never quite certain. We could got the general gist that the boat ship ran north-south. It wasn't until after 83, when my later drawing 86, when we found the keel, which is the red line, and established a keel datum, and then we could collect everything together and get a decent image of the whole ship, which is this next slide. Shows the keel, and there's some 10 meters or so on the port side. The bow is on the right hand side of the image, and there's a couple of 3 meters on the starboard side. And I've tried to relate it to a similar ship. The right hand side of the image, there's a small piece, and I say a small piece, but it's it is just one of those little bits of wood that part of the structure that we brought up just to investigate the condition of the timbers, and then put it back down again. And the bottom there, we actually did bring up a small timber and conserved it. Ed was a chemist, analytical chemist, and was able to take on the conservation work. And this was one of the very successful pieces which you'll find in Portland Museum. So the next stage was actually to document all the artifacts, and I've shown a glass container which was encrusted in concretion with lots of other bits and pieces, and which we in fact have left with the concretion, because it actually gives a nice image. And then we had them arranged with an artist experienced in doing archaeological drawings to draw all the main artifacts, so that there was a proper record. So you have a photograph and a drawing, which actually is much clearer to understand. Sorry, we're going to go overshot then. Ed was a master at finding assistants, and he was able to get a number of specialist experts on gunflints and pottery, bones, analysis of metals and coal, to actually study the artifacts that we brought up and write reports, which could be added to our documentation. And I put this illustration. It was able to get one of the watches that came up is to have it x-rayed. I think we rather hoped that you might have had the hands on it stopped at the moment of it sinking, but not quite as lucky enough to have that. And the display, this was a display in Weymouth Museum, which we did in 2005. We rebuilt the deck of the Abergavenny and a section through the boat, and over the year, I believe 40,000 people came and to see the exhibition, which was free, I might say, very much in the principles and philosophy of the project. And on the 200th anniversary, a plaque was made with recording the tragic loss of the Abergavenny and a piece of William Wordsworth's poetry, which the project funded, and emphasised the fact that the whole project was self-funded by the divers, and that this is on it's been there on the stone pier in Weymouth, within sight of where the ship sank. And there was a wreath, and in fact, that's Edward the Wreath, which on the 5th of February 2005, the lifeboat took the team out to lay a wreath on the site. And there was a plaque put into All Saints Church in Wyke by the Wordsworth Trust and the members of the Wordsworth families sponsored that. So this was the drawing which Lucy referred to before, which we found very useful. It was a recreating that last voyage, and it was drawn by a very clever artist, Jennifer Gunn, for the project. And then in 2003, we had the wreck detectives who were determined to find out why she sank. And they were we had been looking at it for 20 years and not come to any firm conclusion, and they were going to do it in a week. And here you can see there the TV company's ship and our project boat, Ed's private boat, Aquadeep 2. One of the comments that Braithwaite had made was that the knees that hold the deck to the frames of the ship, which is shown under these yellow circles, which normally up to this point had been in wood, and this is one of the transition boats where they had an made of iron, and because it was new technology, it must have been the iron knees was considered by the TV company was most likely problem, because it had been mentioned by Braithwaite, and it was Swedish iron, so it wasn't good British iron, and so they were going to take the knee to Oxford Metallurgy Laboratory to assess if it was poor quality iron. But unfortunately, they weren't able to get it into their car, so they cut the knee in two and took half of there, and sure enough, the iron was absolutely perfect. But however, they did find that it had copper bolts, and so with copper bolts and iron and seawater, there will be elements of corrosion, and they decided that in fact was the reason for it, major reason for its sinking. And my grandson last year came home from school very excited because he'd had the AQA had done a paper about the Abergavenny and about the corrosion between copper and steel, and he was very excited. I'm sorry, I'm gonna. Anyway, that was all very well, but unfortunately, the other half of the knee, when Ed and I went to pick it up, we found it had iron bolts through it, and so if the TV company had taken the other half, the story would have been totally different, and this rather excellent example that the school children enjoyed would not have been used. We've never said anything about it because my grandson thought it was really thought it was an excellent example. What is more, another knee came up, which I think is much more likely is a problem, and this was that the item number one, this long pin, which was, I'm sorry, I'm going to have another drink of water. The long pin, which works very well, and with a short, a number 2, which is a short spike, works very well when it's going along, floating in the sea, but bouncing on the bottom. Fixing number 2 is under stress, and I feel that it would actually, this is the part that would probably start to break up if it's bouncing along on the bottom. Now, I'd like to mention other possible factors contributing to the sinking. There was an incident in Portsmouth before the voyage where the Abergavenny was hit by another ship. Nothing, it wasn't considered a problem, but it might well have accentuated a hidden weakness. There's also a report of another East Indiaman having structural problems with a last frame, so perhaps there was a weakness in that area. And Braithwaite mentioned it, and we certainly discovered there were enormous number of holes, these tree nails, in the framework, which could have been another construction weakness. And finally, she was one of the biggest East Indiaman ever built. Was this because the size exceeded the construction methods of the period? Oh, we should never know. But there were several, I think, there are undoubtedly several reasons for this, for the collapse of the boat. Excuse me. Now, was the pilot to blame for the stranding? And this in itself is another interesting question. And Lucy has mentioned the fact that could he see the marks? But we didn't know whether he was at deck level or in the crow's nest, or perhaps there was a lookout aloft who relayed information, and there could have been some confusion there. Did the pilot appreciate how big the boat was, and what sort of draft it had? And also, did the pilots use the same marks regardless of the size of the ship? And they used to be trimmed so that trimmed for speed. So when the wind dropped and the speed dropped, the stern of the ship would have gone down and needed greater draft. And of course, one has to suggest that as the Abergavenny was the last ship to get a pilot, perhaps the last choice pilot, Thomas James, perhaps wasn't the best pilot. But that's being rather harsh, but we just don't know anything about the man. And lastly, just as worth pointing out, her timing was very unlucky. If the Abergavenny had got to the Shambles 3 hours earlier or later in identical tidal conditions, she would have cleared the bank, or even if it had been a few days earlier or later, everything could conspired against her. And finally, I'd just like to mention a few of the artifacts that we have found. There's something like 50,000 artifacts in total came up, which it would include tens of thousands of gun flints. And at this point, I think I've gone on. I should probably leave it at that. I was going to, if we have time afterwards and people are interested, I can go some of the finds that these are finds that were found left on the wreck subsequent to the sinking. And I'd like to go to my last slide. These are just some of the artifacts which we could come back to. But the most treasured artifact is in fact the gold cufflink with JW on, which we believe is most likely to be John Wordsworth's the captain's own cufflink. And I'd like to record, Ed Cumming sadly died in 2020, but it was his determination over 40 years that made this amazing collection of material possible, and which has now been passed across to Portland Museum, and Lucy would describe the next stage of this project. There is Ed's book on John Wordsworth is freely available to download from the Nautical Archaeology website. Please do try it, and you will find all the facts there. So at that point, I'm going to now hand over to Lucy Watkins.
Thank you, David.
Yes, I'm sorry I went on longer than intended.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm just looking for my control to forward to the next slide. Here we go. Yeah. So you've heard the story of the Earl of Abergavenny and heard from David about its excavation. We're going to talk next about the amazing project that David designed for Portland Museum to digitally record the finds from the shipwreck, which is the Diving into the Digital Archives of the Earl of Abergavenny project. So the Earl of Abergavenny project is National Lottery funded, and its primary goal is to develop digital skills amongst volunteers in the heritage sector. Essentially, what we're doing is using the Earl of Abergavenny collection as a vehicle for training volunteers in 3 key digital skills. After the training component, we're committed to sharing the methodology and learning points from the project with other heritage organisations and wider audiences. And this is through the production of a volunteer training manual and a programme of outreach activities. So we have these amazing teams of volunteers across the country that are heavily invested in collections and heritage stories. What this project is enabling volunteers to do is to share the collections and stories that they love far and wide. So the 3 key digital training skills are 3D digital modelling, and for that we use photogrammetry, modes, which is a collections management system for making an inventory and catalogue of the finds, and condition assessing and recording the finds. So firstly, we're making 3D digital models of the finds from the Earl of Abergavenny using really what's quite a basic photography setup, which includes iPads, a simple lighting system, and an app called Polycam. And it's this app that produces the 3D digital models. What we do is to take multiple photographs of the objects from lots of different angles. The app then stitches all these photos together, and hey presto, we have our 3D digital model. Because we have limited space in the museum, like a lot of museums, we don't have room to display many of the collection items. So the production and online display of these 3D models means we can show objects that people wouldn't normally see because they're in storage, or perhaps a viewer is unable to visit the museum. So this part of the training was led by specialist archaeological contractors MSDS Marine, and then followed up by Portland Museum. MSDS came to the museum on 4 or 5 occasions to train small groups of our volunteers in the digital 3D modelling, taking sessions using Polycam and then following up with a pro software package for the volunteers who wanted something more advanced. So secondly, we built an inventory catalogue of the collection in a specialist museum database called Modes, and the training for this was led by Modes themselves. So every item will have a recorded location so that now anyone who views a collection item online, so they look at our Sketchfab site perhaps, they can take note of the item's ID number and can come into the museum to see the real thing. In a practical sense, they can email me and say, a researcher might email me and say, Lucy, I'd love to see part of this, a clay pipe or a pulley wheel. they can give me the ID number, and I can drag that object out for them to actually look at in real life when they come to the museum. So thirdly, our volunteers are trained in how to assess and record the condition of the items. So this part of the training has been taken by the Nautical Archaeology Society, and also Nancy Grace, who's a Portland Museum trustee and National Trust archaeologist of 35 years. So now we're recording the condition of the collections items. We can keep an eye on whether any changes or any signs of degradation are taking place over time. So finally, one of our volunteers writes interpretation for each collection item for its display on Sketchfab. This is the 3D modelling platform that anyone with online access can view. You can see underneath the 3D model of the clay pipe, it's actually 2D here, but it'll be 3D on Sketchfab. You can see a set of information such as the object size, weight, display location, etc. And this template is the same for each item that you view. Underneath that is the interpretation for each object that one of our volunteers writes for us. So this volunteer, Paul, obtains the information from the original Earl of Abergavenny archive that was put together by the late Ed Cumming, who, as you know, led the Earl of Abergavenny dive team and produced so much of the information on the ship. And here are some of our amazing volunteers. So you can see on the left, Gillian and Claire, who are 3D modelling a piece of glass. Up on the right, you can see Nick, who's doing some of the condition assessing and recording. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see Paul, who, as I previously mentioned, uploads the objects, the 3D digital models from Polycam, where they were made, up to Sketchfab. So 3D modelling the finds from the Earl of Abergavenny hasn't always been easy. We've had some failures, but the volunteers' tenacity and, most importantly, their willingness to experiment with, after all, what is a new technology, has produced many beautiful models. And I do urge you to look at our Sketchfab site to see some of these after the presentation. So some of the challenges to achieving productions of successful models have been overcome by a healthy dose of communication between volunteer teams. If one individual or a team discovers a new way of perhaps lighting an object or taking photos in sections as opposed to capturing the whole object within a frame, then these discoveries are passed on to other teams via our WhatsApp group or through museum staff directly. And here again, you can see some of our volunteers. So on the far left there, you can see Guido, who's doing more condition assessing and recording. What he's done there is to photograph an item that he's recording. That photograph will go on to a special form that's been designed for us by Peter Knott of NAS. When that form is complete with information and the images, that will be passed to Jill on his left, who's working on modes. So that condition assessment and record form will become part of its modes record. On the right there, you can see Seth and Barbara and Graham, who are 3D imaging. What does that look like? A pulley block. And then in the bottom, in the middle there, there's Diamante, who comes down from Bournemouth, and she's 3D modelling a glass vial. So last summer, we took our show out on the road. We appeared at lots of different venues with our Earl of Abergavenny pop-up museum, taking real collection items and showing off our 3D digital models. We appeared at a huge variety of events, from the British Archaeology Festival at Corfe Castle to the Chesil Beach Centre on the causeway between Weymouth and Portland to our local island dog show. MSDS Marine came along to our Chesil Beach Centre pop-up and brought lots of children's activities with them, so kids and their families could wander off onto the beach with mini backpacks and be archaeologists for the day. They could pick up interesting looking objects and show them to an MSDS archaeologist who'd identify them when they came back from their discovery walk. And I should actually, I should mention that we continue to do some of our outreach activities, and we're appearing at Chalk Valley History Festival, which is just south of Salisbury, in the last week of June, if anybody's interested. So we've benefited hugely by working with partner organisations on the Earl of Abergavenny project. Our knowledge of the collection has improved vastly by working with the Nautical Archaeology Society and MSDS Marine. You can see Mark Beattie Edwards up there in the top right-hand corner. We've also set up a partnership with Royal Museums Greenwich as well, who've helped train our volunteers to write interpretation for our museum collections and carry out collections reviews too. We've also worked with local arts company NPO B-Side. So one of their bursary artists has taken workshops for our volunteers to develop creative work as a response to some of the Earl of Abergavenny collections items. And this has been a great opportunity to create real engagement with the collection. Some of the feedback we got from our volunteers at the beginning of the project was that they wanted to get hands-on with artifacts, and it was that real sense of touch that was so important to them. So they've been able to get that feel for objects, and we've the B-Side artist has used a lot of clay in the creative workshop, so there's been lots of hands-on stuff going on there. So finally, the NAS and MSDS Marine have developed a volunteer training manual in the 3 key digital recording techniques we've used to catalogue the collection. We're sharing this with as many heritage organisations as we can reach, in the hope that they too can make their collections visible to global audiences in the way that our volunteers have. So on the left of the screen here, you'll see on the back of one of our Earl of Abergavenny project cards a QR code. This would take you to Linktree, and this Linktree is everything Earl of Abergavenny related. So it'll take you to our Earl of Abergavenny website on the Port and Museum website. It'll take you to the NAS site where Ed Cummings' original research is located. And it'll also take you to our Sketchfab site where you can see our 3D digital models. Finally, on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the volunteer training manual there. Underneath that is another QR code that'll take you directly to the site where the volunteer training manual is held. And that training manual is free to view and to download. So I'll hand you back to Alison now, and we'll move across to the Q&A section and your chance to give us some feedback.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, David. That was absolutely brilliant. David, you might want to turn your camera and your microphone back on now and join us for a bit of a chat. If people in the audience haven't seen, I've been popping links related to the project in the chat. So Lucy's been talking about lots of cool things, and the links are there for you to have an explore of. We've got time for a few questions now. Now, you can do that a few ways. The easiest way for me is if you use the Q&A button on the Zoom toolbar to post any questions for us. If you struggle to find that, though, just pop them in the chat and I will do my best to pick up your questions. So my first question is going to be to David, I think. And David, I'm going to ask you, what's been your personal favourite artefact that you found on the wreck?
Well, there's certainly a wide selection, but one of the ones, it is the unusual one, and it is a pencil. And we had discovered a pencil, and perhaps 10 years, literally 10 years later, Ed went up to the pencil museum and mentioned that we had this, what was described as a mechanical pencil, and they hadn't got one. And then subsequently, he found there were, in fact, only 3 of these pencils in the world. And we actually have 20 of them. And they are just beautiful things that have survived 200 years underwater. And they're made of wood with dovetail joints. You can slide it forward. And it's just, it is the simplicity of this little humble object that it actually gives you a little insight into what life was like in 1805.
They are brilliant, the pencils, I have to say, and they're so nice to be able to show people as well, because they're so well, people identify with and they recognise them from things they use today. And it's the same for me with the toothbrushes from the wreck as well, because they're very clearly toothbrushes. Now, I've got a question for both of you, really. I don't mind who wants to take this one, or I can even jump in on it. So someone has asked, is the wreck a protected site or a war grave, considering soldiers were on board at the time? Does anybody want to take that, or do you want me to tackle that one?
I think, Alison, it would be better if you actually covered that one.
Okay, I'll tackle that one. So my background is I spent 10 years working for Historic England, managing protected wreck sites. So I love a protected wreck site. Now, for quirks of history, I think I'm going to put it, the site was never protected under the 1973 Act, and it wasn't scheduled under the 79 Act. And whilst it could be considered in some ways as a war grave, although war graves don't really exist in law because there were soldiers on board, it wasn't an MOD vessel, it wasn't a military vessel, so it can't be protected under any of that legislation either. However, I think all of us here recognise the site is of national significance, and I'm pleased to be able to say that colleagues at Historic England have been looking at the site, haven't they, David, for scheduling potentially going forward. So it's a no at this time, but I think it would be a real achievement for the project if the site was recognised for its national significance and protected going forward.
And we would be particularly interested in having it scheduled so that it would be on all maps and charts, because there are in Weymouth Bay, there's numerous boats and ships who anchor there, and have certainly in the past their anchors have dragged across the site, and that is what we would wish that was stopped.
Yeah, and I think it definitely needs to happen. But I do want to say, David, that I think it's testament to the work that both you and Ed did on the site, that it was never protected at the time because you were doing such a great job on the site. There was no need for the archaeological community to get involved and to do that designation process. My next question, I think I'm going to give to you, Lucy, if that's okay. Someone's commented, brilliant, well done for everything you've done. And you may or may not be able to answer this question off the top of your head, but how many artefacts or percentage of the wider collection have you digitised or accessioned so far?
Well, I can tell you exactly how many are up on Sketchfab, and that's 201. We've tried to be kind of quite balanced in the type of artifacts that we've modelled. So we've tried to model a variety of categories. So bits of ship, like the riggings, parts of the rigging, personal items that would have belonged to passengers, crew or soldiers. But up on Sketchfab at the moment, there's 201 models. I think there's possibly a handful more lurking in Polycam that are waiting to be uploaded, but that's probably only about probably only about 10% of what there is. I mean, obviously there's multiple items of some type, so we've got hundreds and hundreds of pieces of flint. We won't 3D model all those pieces of flint. We'll kind of choose a variety of slightly different types. But yeah, 201 up on Sketchfab.
So that's brilliant. And I personally think the project has come such a long way. I remember discussing it with David when we were at the application stage, and actually so much has been achieved over the last couple of years, and especially given the fact that COVID has happened in the middle of it as well, and the project team have done a fantastic job. So congratulations, Lucy, to you and to you, David, and to everybody else at Portland Museum and the volunteers. My final question, and I'm really conscious of time, so thank you everyone for bearing with us, and this is to both of you, is what is the plan going forward? What are the next steps for the project, or is this it for the Earl of Abergavenny?
Well, the volunteers are really enthusiastic about carrying on, so much so that we actually got a three-month extension to the project. So it was actually due to finish at the end of March, and the National Lottery asked us if we wanted to extend it till the end of June, which is great. But it has been one of the most amazing parts of the project, is watching people who've had no previous digital skills As I said, their tenacity and their willingness to experiment has produced these amazing 3D digital models. And now they're able to carry that on, you know, independently. That the chances are they'll do it with us at Portland Museum, but they can take those skills anywhere else and share them with other heritage organisations too.
Brilliant. I think it's been absolutely fantastic. On that note, I'm going to stop the recording for today. We're at the end of